You're not hearing the point. देखिए, extent as is expressly authorized by or under the Constitution. 184 पार तो हमें दिया हुआ है ना आइन ने, हमें बस खुद से तो नहीं आया ना, दिया हुआ है आइन ने, ठीक है? The enlargement of the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Now the question is that 184(3) power that is already given to us. The Constitution could have not given that power to us. It is not an inherent power of the nature as under Section 9 of the Civil Procedure Code. Correct?
My lord.
It's an extraordinary power which is rarely given in any constitution in the world.
Correct, man.
Correct? So
Correct.
far we are good.
Correct.
So that power was given by the Constitution. Enlarging the power or taking away the power?
My lord, twofold answer. They are taking away the power.
How?
By, and I rely on the judgment.
तो judgment को छोड़िए ना, आप arguments दीजिए ना अपने.
मैं arguments precedent की base पे दूँगा.
आप अपने हम no contention road कर लेंगे आपके.
My lord, it is a curtailment of power because the concept of finality that attaches to judgments under Article 184(3)
That's a different
is taken away.
concept. देखिए, for instance, a 3-member bench decides something. Naturally, a 3-member bench cannot undo it. 5-member bench हो गई या whatever, full court हो गया. तो 184(3) की उन्होंने enlarge कर दिया power. ठीक है? I'm trying to wrap my head around the fact that you keep saying that it's taking away the power. The first power was conferred by Parliament through the Constitution. That power is being enlarged. If this power was given to, for instance, the Senate of Pakistan, okay, you will sit in appeal over 184(3) because Supreme Court can't sit in appeal over its own orders. So then maybe, yes, you're absolutely correct. But this power, it has not gone out of this building. It remains within the building. And unless you say 2 minds are always better than 5, that ends the story. You know, so you're saying that more minds would actually be destructive of the 184 inherent power if they think about something, or with the passage of time they may want to revisit things or maybe want to appeal things. I mean, you know, one thing is of course you can revisit something, ठीक है, वो तो एक अलग बात हो जाती है, वो तो revisit आप करते रहें, फिर वो देखें number of the judges count होगा, ये होगा वगैरह होगा. बट ये तो एक स्पेसिफिक पावर दिया रहा है. इसमें मुझे समझ नहीं आ रही है, मेरे पावर क्या सुप्रीम, मेरे तो पावर्स कम हो रहे हैं, सुप्रीम कोर्ट के पावर्स बढ़ रहे हैं, तो इसमें आप कैसे कह रहे हैं कि कम हो रहे हैं, ये जरा समझाइए मुझे.
My lord, as I said, I am as a counsel of this court bound by the law that your lordships lay down in precedents.
No, sorry to say, this is, आप मुझे कोई चीज बता दें. You as a council are first and foremost bound by the Constitution of Pakistan and the laws of Pakistan. फिर उसके बाद प्रेसिडेंट आएगा. प्रेसिडेंट आप लोग सब पहले रख देते हैं आइन और उसको छोड़ दीजिए, वो बाद में आता है. पहले आएगा आइन, फिर आएगा लॉ, फिर आएगा प्रेसिडेंट. ठीक है? सुप्रीम courts, if they've been making laws, I think that's wrong. Their power is to interpret law. If a law violates some constitutional provision, strike it down. Now, we cannot assume power. I have not taken an oath to uphold the judgments of the Supreme Court. I have taken an oath to uphold the Constitution and the law of Pakistan until such time that law, I feel, is violative of a fundamental right or whatever you want to argue, even the whole scheme of legislative scheme that has been laid out. I'm not bound by precedents. If that was the case, I would not have taken oath even as a judge, if I'm bound by all the precedents of the Supreme Court. Even dissent, even if the whole court says, I can still maintain I don't agree, but it will still be binding on me. That's a different thing. 189 says it will still be binding on me, but I can say I disagree. Otherwise, you kill dissent also. Then everybody has to agree to everything else. So don't just, these are important questions. You're just sort of saying that your powers have been taken away. I don't feel they've been taken away.
Before you,
if
if you could explain the entry 55 again, I haven't got it. General उसमें बता दें.
My lord, entry 55 allows, number one, only the enlargement of jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, and only where there is express authorization to that effect in the Constitution, by the Constitution or under the Constitution.
Enlargement का क्या मतलब है? How do you understand enlargement?
Enlargement, for me, as a matter of plain English, means something exists and you make it bigger. As again, my lord, with all
doesn't it destroy your argument?
My lord, let me articulate. The word enlargement, what enlargement means in the context of entry 55, and what enlargement means in the context of entry 55 has been interpreted by this honorable court.
Learned Council, जरा मेरे समझने के लिए, there can be two situations. One, 184.3 ना होता, और सिर्फ एक अपील दे दी जाती. Now here, 184.3 jurisdiction already exists. A remedy is being provided. So there's a distinction between these two situations. The jurisdiction already exists.
My lord, I'll come to that.
An appeal is a substantive right. It has to be substantively given by substantive provision in the Act or the Constitution. You cannot by implication or by rules or by subordinate legislation create a right. 184.3 is a jurisdiction in itself, the original jurisdiction. For 50 years it has existed as such. Why do you think even the dictators or even the legislative assemblies which amended the Constitution did not legislate on the one hand or amend the Constitution on the other, and why has it all of a sudden now been done, under what circumstances?
Yeah, Learned Council, Learned Council, I think there's a...
Mr. Bandari, you are in a very unenviable position.
Learned Council,
I sympathize with you.
I
sympathize.
I can assure that many of your lordship's questions might be answered, and I can't say will be answered, only if I'm allowed to articulate my
Council, I think...
I can assure, my lord, if your lordship will just allow me to articulate my submissions.
बहुत अच्छा question इन्होंने raise किया है. I think that is also to be seen in historical context. There were only two judgments of this court after this constitution was promulgated: Darshan Masih case and Benazir Bhutto's case. Regrettably, this court, after 2010, departed from both those judgments. And the manner in which 184.3 in many cases was used, that probably is one reason why the parliament, a representative body, wanted or intended to have these remedies.
My lord, if you can go back to entry 55.
I'll go back to entry 55. But just as a brief riposte to that, my lord, two wrongs don't make a right. If this court was wrong, then the parliament is wrong now, and two wrongs will not make a right. And I'll come back to that. My lord, I'll come back to that. Let me go back to entry 55.
So going back to entry 55, can I be your voice on the bench and help you?
I'll be so grateful.
So what you're trying to say is, just to support you and so that nobody sort of... So what you're trying to say is that entry 55 says that there has to be express authorization from within the Constitution for enlargement of jurisdiction. And one prime example is, just as Asha had asked a question, prime example is 185.3, which says specifically that you can enlarge the monetary jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. So that is the express provision mentioned. Isn't that the case?
My lord.
So my question then is that if this is what you're saying that it is purely there has to be express provision in the Constitution, even though I don't understand the under the Constitution. But anyway, let's stick to the by the Constitution. And example would be 185, and perhaps there are some other provisions which would give that express.
I'll come to that.
But my problem with this is that when we talk about enhancement of jurisdiction, I see that, but I have a problem with the practice and procedure part. That practice and procedure doesn't really flow out of 55. And that kind of makes the word law then redundant in 191, because that law is not finding any support. Even if we say 191 is not enabling provision, then that law must stand alone, must draw some power from competence from some source. It's not coming out of 55 because it is purely for enlargement of jurisdiction.
Well, it will come if 55 is rightly invoked, then practice and procedure will come in through entry 59. That, my lord, the Chief Justice.
No, but 59 reads that it has to be read along with the substantive part of it, which is enhancement of jurisdiction. So enhancement of jurisdiction is related.
Let me give. There are, to my humble knowledge, there used to be one very clear provision, was Zain Wali Constitution Dena, regarding enlargement of jurisdiction, and which was actually taken notice of by this court in Baz Muhammad Kakar's case. This was, my lord, before its repeal, this was Article 247, Clause 7.
इसका आप पेज 970 पे पढ़िए ना जरा,
जी
पैराग्राफ पढ़ दीजिए, इसमें बहुत सारी चीजें बाज मोहम्मद काकड़ वाले केस के अंदर हैं
जी,
पेज 970 पे पढ़िए, एज इट हैज बीन पॉइंटेड आउट, इसमें तो इन्होंने सपोर्ट किया है कि जो है जुरिस्डिक्शन को बढ़ाना हो, सप्लीमेंटल करना हो तो कर सकती है पार्लियामेंट।
वो रिपील हो गया ना 247 जो
नहीं, आप कौन सा
तो हो गया, बट द जजमेंट इज देयर, सुप्रीम कोर्ट का अपना जजमेंट तो है ना, वो रिपील।
Para 37 of Baz Muhammad Kakar, if I can just read this out, Article 247, Clause 7, as now
Page
it's
कौन
been,
सा पढ़ने page?
well, this is the Constitution itself. This was prior to its repeal.
No,
by the-
बाज मोहम्मद काकड़ का page कौन सा?
Page 967, Para 37.
Citation.
This is PLD 2012 Supreme Court, 923, Para 37 at 967. This is one example of enlargement of jurisdiction of the Supreme Court in terms of Article 247, Clause 7, which read, my lord, neither the Supreme Court nor a High Court shall exercise any jurisdiction under the Constitution in relation to a tribal area unless Majlis-e-Shura, Parliament by law otherwise provides. And pursuant to this, an act was promulgated in 1973. And this was taken notice of by this honorable court in. My lord, that's one example. The other is, as your lordship mentioned, Article 185 of the Constitution.
185.3 is very
185, 2D and E.
2, 3, Sorry,
These are
D,
express authorizations by the
185
Constitution.
D, yes.
185, 2D and also E.
नहीं, ये पेज 970 पे सप्लीमेंटल पावर का भी जिक्र है, पेज 970 पे जो पैराग्राफ है ना, वो आप पढ़िए, वो डिटेल में है,
जी जी,
उसमें ये क्लैरिटी आ जाती है, as it has been pointed out here and above.
My question is that even for a minute, I mean just something that if we were to leave 55 for a minute, what is really stopping, I mean it's a question of interpretation, what's really stopping us from interpreting 191 to mean that it actually is envisaging a law for practice and procedure. It is the enabling provision. Suppose if we go in that direction, what comes in our way? I mean, that sort of solves a lot of mystery also. It is saying that the Constitution is envisaging that the Constitution could provide for practice and procedure, some law could provide for practice and procedure, and the Supreme Court can its rules provide for procedure. Meaning by, one way of looking at it is, meaning by that the Constitution is saying that, yes, for the purposes of practice and procedure, there could be a law. So 191 could be read as an enabling provision. If that is read as an enabling provision, then it sort of solves.
My lord, with all due respect, in my opinion, it can't be read as an enabling provision. It is a limitation, and the limitation that it imposes on the Supreme Court's power is not limited to practice and procedure.
No, but
let me just finish. Supposing can the Supreme Court rules cannot say that in adjudicating our appeals regarding contractual issues, we will not take into account the contract.
My problem is that suppose there were no rules made by the Supreme Court. So how would we look at 191 then? And then there is a law, the word law is mentioned. Suppose it's a total green field, there's nothing in the... So then a law could be there to regulate the practice and procedure. If the Supreme Court decides not to make the rules for a minute, then the source could be law itself. To call it limiting would be not...
My lord, could it be provincial law also? The law will
considering that it relates to, I mean that's another issue with entry 58, that what does relate to federation mean? So if it relates to federation, perhaps it's a federal law that we're talking about or not, that's another question that I want to ask.
The problem is, I said, there is a structural limitation on the word law in Article 191. You can't read it. Shoresh Kashmiri's case, PLD 69 Supreme Court 14 said, law is very broad. But here you will not include provincial law. You will, in my humble opinion, you will not include ordinances because ordinances are executive acts. if you allow, my lord, if I can just finish this, my lord, if you allow ordinances and rules which are law to be read into law in Article 191, what happens to 175(3)? Judiciary has to be separate from the executive. How can you allow the executive to make rules for practice and procedure of the Supreme Court? So the law, the word law in 191 has inbuilt limitations. I concede that it will include Act of Parliament, but in certain limited circumstances. Only when entry 55's conditions are met.
Your answer to the issue is that you would come through 55, you would come up with a law relating to enhancement, which is explicitly provided, and in that law,
yes,
you could then ancillary provide for practice and procedure.
That's my reading.
That's the only way
That's the only way you can.
But then those provisions would relate to the enlargement part,
yes,
not anything more than that.
Not anything. And that's why I say it's a very restricted power. My lord, sorry.
In terms of you raised a very interesting way to look at this thing, but I think if we look at law as conferring an enabling jurisdiction, I think one issue with 191 is that we have on the same thing, namely the practice and procedure of the court, we have two law-making powers. One is the Supreme Court. It's a direct grant by the Constitution. And if law is read in an enabling sense, then Parliament also. So this creates a situation where on the same subject matter, if I may use that term, ordinarily the problem arises where on the same subject matter, the division in terms of law-making ability is between federation and the provinces, right? So to take a very simple example, entry 49 of the taxes on income other than agricultural income, right? So the subject matter is tax on income. And the Constitution splits it into two. Agricultural income goes to the provinces, this goes to the, and we have whole issues of trespass and this, that, and you know all of that. Here the interesting thing is that on the same subject matter, practice and procedure, you have the Constitution is giving a grant to the Supreme Court itself. If law is read as an enabling power in Article 191, then the same power is conferred on a separate branch, the legislative branch. So, in terms of the principle of separation of powers, how do we resolve, how would we resolve a conflict if law over there is to be read as an enabling power? In terms of legislative competence, the division between federation and provinces, we know all of that. But here, how would we draw the distinction? How would we resolve a conflict? So maybe, because speaking for myself, I am not too satisfied with the way you are identifying it with entry number 55. Seems to me that a more natural on your reading would be entry 58. But that would mean that it is not an enabling provision. It doesn't really, it allows them to restrict, otherwise the conflict between two separate branches, making something that is law on the same subject matter, how would that be resolved?
My lord, I will address that.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. You want to mull it over. We will reconvene after lunch or prayers. ठीक है? तो आप आधे घंटे में वापस आ जाते हैं.
आधे घंटे में ठीक है.
ठीक है. You can mull it over the question before you start. We don't want to cut you short and you start something it doesn't finish.
ठीक sir.
ठीक है.
ठीक है. I'm grateful. Grateful.
आमीन. एक मिनट करना है या मैं करा नहीं मैं थोड़ा कैमरा फिर ऑन पूरा करके देना तो